feel, you make me feel brand new. You do. That's why I say, I know it's safe for you. You make me feel brand new. I know you do.
Your favorite community radio, Eden FM, live in the heart of the Garden Route.
A small boat on the ocean, sending big waves into motion, like how a single word can make a heart open. I might only have one match, but I can make an explosion. And all those things I didn't say were wrecking balls inside my brain. I will scream loud tonight. Can you hear my voice this time? This is my fight song. Take back my life song. Prove I'm alright song. My power's turned on. Starting right now. I'll be strong. I'll play my fight song. And I don't really care if nobody else believes, 'cause I've still got a lot of fight left in me.
Wel, goeienaand, Eden FM luisteraars en welkom hier by ons het koppe by mekaar. Dit is Thea Smit wat praat en my kollegas vanaand saam met my Hans van der Veen. Goeienaand Hans, hoe gaan dit met jou?
Goeienaand, Thea, lekker om saam met julle te wees hierso. Goeienaand luisteraars.
En die Hans, ek voordat ek ons gas voorstel, jare terug was daar so 'n liedjie gewees wat almal so diep geskok het, 'n liedjie van Right Said Fred wat gesê het, let's talk about sex baby, let's talk about you and me.
Me. Ja, let's talk about.
Onthou jy dit?
Ek het ook al vroeër vanaand aan daai liedjie gedink.
Luister, vanaand praat ons weer oor seks. SEX, ouers, gaan sit julle kinders in die bed en jong mense of die wat nou bo ouderdom is, skuif nader, want vanaand praat ons oor daai groot woord, die olifant in die kamer, seks. En ons gas was laasweek by ons en ons dink dit was sulke interessante inligting wat sy gegee het en ons verwelkom haar weer terug. Good evening, Nazneen Furfuri. How are you doing?
Good evening, listeners, and good evening all. I'm quite excited to be here again. I'm doing well.
So, welcome Nazneen. So
Thank
Nazneen,
you.
verstaan Afrikaans, sy praat Engels. Julle kan saam met ons gesels vanaand oor seks. Hier op Eden FM by ons het koppe by mekaar. Die nommer is 060 505 2693. Nazneen is 'n kliniese sielkundige in die weermag of hoe sê ons, wat is die korrekte
Yes.
politiese woord? En sy's gestasioneer by 2 hospitale as ek reg is.
Easterblad, at Air Force Base Easterblad, sorry.
Easterblad.
Yeah.
And she has got a special interest in sexual health. And that is what we spoke about last week. And we are going to continue tonight about certain topics that we felt would be interesting. But we would really like to know from you, the audience out there. You can send anonymous WhatsApps to the number, and you can ask questions that you might be too embarrassed to ask your doctor, or your wife, or your husband, or your partner. And we will endeavor to answer those questions here. Now, Nazneen, last week we spoke a lot about especially sexual health in teenagers and how social media impacts. You were giving an interesting statistic that we see a lot of sexual problems amongst younger males, if I'm correct, and
Yes.
especially amongst people of color. And they thought that it was part or due to the social media or the exposure that young kids have. just to add on to that question, we were also discussing a little bit about grooming last week, I think in between our breaks. And can you maybe just elaborate a little bit on what is sexual grooming? How does it happen? How can the public become aware of that?
So I think we all know about sexual grooming, sort of that we see in films, we hear about in the media, we hear about pedophilia and about sexual abuse, trauma, and sexual assault amongst children. But I think what has happened in the last maybe about 3 years now is that there's been an expose done on South Africa, and I think there's been a podcast by Dion Wiggett, and he's also written a book on the same subject matter called My Only Story. And I think he's unearthed a lot of pedophilia amongst school-going boys, mostly amongst boys, but also amongst girls, and particularly with teachers, sports coaches, teachers, and these are authority figures that we trust as adults. We trust when we send our child to school that they will be safe there. So I just thought I'm going to highlight some stages that he recommends that adults should be on the lookout for. So in essence, sexual grooming is actually teaching a child from a very young age how to become sexualized, and then also after becoming sexualized, how to start performing sexual acts in sort of bite-sized chunks it's sort of a phased approach, and it scales up as the sexual acts increase in sort of severity and in terms of frequency. So he talks about the first stage as being when a sexual predator chooses a target. And the way a sexual predator chooses a target is by choosing a child that is isolated, or is a loner, or that the predator can get alone. So maybe somebody that they watch on a school playground or in a class, and that doesn't seem to have a lot of friends. So this child doesn't have a support network amongst their peers, and then might feel shame or stigma for being singled out by that predator. Then he talks about the second stage as gaining the child's trust. And this you do by observing the child's needs and weaknesses, and then sort of capitalizing on the weaknesses. The third stage is when you fulfill that child's needs. So if a child feels unspecial or feels as if they need to be praised for a particular talent or skill that they have, and the predator then fulfills that need by giving them attention. Then the fourth stage is when the predator targets that child and gives that child gifts to affirm that child, or gives the child special attention. And then the last stage is when the child, using that special relationship, now isolates the child and then starts sort of teaching the child what is sexualized behavior, up until the child doesn't feel so uncomfortable about participating in a sexual act. So it might start, for example, as, let's say, massaging, or even just touching on the shoulder, and then sort of moving your hand down. And so you're testing the child all the time. And when the child starts to get uncomfortable, then you kind of give the child reassurance. You know, I'm a teacher. This is okay. If you don't feel comfortable, just tell me. And usually the child won't speak out. And so I think it's also confusing for the child here when we talk about sexual grooming, because the child already trusts the teacher. And so when something inappropriate happens, they don't actually question what has happened. They just kind of think, oh, this is okay. This is a teacher. I'm safe. So even when something inappropriate happens, they kind of try to rationalize that behavior. So I thought we really need to sensitize our viewers and our listeners to this kind of sexual grooming behavior, because it's not just our teachers. It might just be another adult figure that we do trust, and to identify the signs.
Ms. Neen, I am just wondering, can this sexual grooming also occur with adults?
So it can. I think, we're all on a different continuum of how much we know about sex, or how little we know about sex. And I think when an adult is very naive, maybe somebody that grew up very religious and doesn't know, very sheltered upbringing, or hasn't really been introduced to sex, then I think it's quite easy then to start grooming them, even in a workplace. I think, and even
Mm.
if you are sort of more street smart in a workplace, I think there's still sort of a lot of sexual jokes that can happen that can make you feel uncomfortable, but you don't talk out because the majority of the workplace finds these jokes funny. I think there's also a kind of sexual grooming in maybe more male dominated environments, or when there is sort of power amongst a certain group of people that sort of portray this kind of environment in the workplace.
Mm.
Um,
Yes, Anne?
Nazneen, so with sexual grooming, what happens is that the child's, or it could be young adult, first sexual experience is in a way afterwards, when this person gets older, realizes it was wrong. And it feels to me that's where the sexual trauma actually really hits home. Then, you know, if I think in terms of psychotherapy, when I work with adults that were, you know, exposed to sex at a young age, initially you think this what I'm doing is special. There's nothing wrong with it, and you might even be enjoying it because your body is a biological organism. So stimulation will at a point be fun, and I think a lot of us think of sex or molestation as being like of a forced nature, but it's not a forced nature. So it's your whole, it's this thing of trusting the person, trusting your body, trusting the experience you have in your body, and then as an adult, now suddenly you realize this what you believed was true and was good, and maybe was I thought it was beautiful. Suddenly it was all wrong, and somewhere there it feels to me that's and that's, I think, in therapy is often what we try and you know, fix that, or and it's not an easy process. I'd like to hear from the two of you how you see it.
So I think with it's right what you say. I think there's a lot of shame attached when the body responds, and like rightfully so. The body is a physiological organism, like you say, and so will respond to any kind of pleasurable activity. So, and I think especially when it is with an adult, and you feel ashamed of what your body does in that situation, and so it kind of helps you. It sort of it makes you part of the secret now, because I keep that person's secret, but that person also keeps my secret, and so this person doesn't tell my parents that I've enjoyed this, and so in some way I've been complicit, and I think this is where that trauma starts. It's this kind of understanding that I did this partially to myself, and so I too am to blame for this, and that person was just a facilitator that showed me that I have this kind of interest. And so it isn't coercive, but it is non-consensual. I think we must make that quite clear. There is never, that's not a consensual relationship, but even after the child then tries to sort of procure sex from that older adult, that is still non-consensual. So if you are introduced into sex at the early age and you don't really understand what it is you are saying yes to, that is not informed consent. And I think it's important that we make that clear. I've had a patient in the last few months, a male patient, and he was introduced to sex at the age of 11 by an older cousin, a female cousin, and had then sort of initiated the rest of his sexual um, sort of repertoire around what has happened with his cousin. And then even after he started procuring the sex from her, he kind of thought, but oh, then it's now consensual, and I've asked for it and I want it, and so I sort of procure that for myself, although it's not the same. I think all the way up until you understand what is really happening, that means it's non-consensual. But I do think it changes sort of all sexual relationships going forward. And with this particular client, he only sees females now as sexual objects, because that is how he was really introduced into affirmation, validation, sort of affection, love was all sexual. So it was extremely difficult seeing him. And he was very guarded. So also a lot of shame, but we couldn't even go there because he had his walls up so high. So I think it really then taints the way you are in relationships. And I think that trauma might have started before you even had the understanding, but then as an adult, you can try and process that. But it is very long-term work. Yes, yeah.
Nazneen, I like what you are saying now because, when we talk about molestation and when we talk about grooming, most of us, and I'm sitting here and I need to challenge myself also because I think most of us get this picture of a little girl and an older man, and it's not always the case. It could be a boys, it could be males, an older male and a younger boy. It could be an older lady and a younger boy. It could be an older woman and a younger girl. So it's not gender specific. And, so that I just would like to maybe talk about that and talk to the listeners and say, it's not just one specific category where grooming can take place, and it's not a specific age where grooming can take place. And I also liked what you said about, that the grooming takes place, but later on, the person that was molested thinks that it's they are initiating it, but they've got this unhealthy picture of what sexual encounters should be. Did I sum it up more or less?
Yes, yeah. And I think when we talk about gender-based violence, our reference point is always women and girl children. But gender-based violence includes males and females and intersex individuals. So we really need to broaden the terminology that we use to incorporate everyone. Because otherwise we give the message and we communicate the message that it's only girls and only females that report sexual abuse. And I think that is damaging when we silence the rest of the individuals.
But we do see in our stats that girls are more prone to report sexual abuse, and that brings me to my next question just before the ad, or before we go to a break. Why is it so difficult for males to speak up about sexual abuse?
So I think
what hampers them?
I think before we go to that, I think our reporting of stats is inaccurate.
Okay.
I think the reporting system is made easier for females. I think if a male were to walk into a police station right now and say he was sexually molested, I think he'd be laughed at, to be honest. I don't think it's taken as seriously. I don't think there is an urgency to respond. So I do think we make it difficult. In that also when we do these gender-based violence, drives in our workplaces and in the communities, we actually market that towards females. We don't really have strong males also representing the other side. So I think there are some barriers. I think I can come to some of the barriers after the break.
Yes. So let us go to a break. Luisteraars, julle is welkom om regtig saam met ons te gesels. Ek gee weer die nommer is 060 505 2693. Ons sal graag wil hoor wat julle dink en waaroor julle wonder, soos julle daar by die huis sit. Ons luister na een van Nazneen se liedjies, Sun in My Pocket, deur, is dit Lockenwil? Lockenwil, daar's dit. En kom weer terug, luisteraars, dan praat ons verder.
Your favorite community radio, Eden FM, live in the heart of the Garden Route.
Welkom terug, Eden FM luisteraars, en julle luister na ons sit koppe by mekaar. En vanaand is dit ek, Thea Smith en Hans van der Veen wat in die ateljee is, en ons gas se naam is Nazneen Ververy. Sy is 'n kliniese sielkundige by die Weermag en het 'n spesiale belangstelling in seksuele gesondheid. Nasneen, luisteraars, ek weet nie of julle hy nommer het nie, maar ek gee hom maar nou weer vir julle. 060-505-2693. Ons wag vir julle WhatsApps om deur te kom. Nasneen, before the ad, we were talking about grooming and we were talking about consent and not consent. Can you maybe speak to us what is consensual sex? What does it look like in practice?
I just want to respond to your question from before the break. So why do
Yes.
men and boys not report sexual assault or sexual abuse? So I think three things that came up for me that I was thinking about is that there's a lot of stigma attached to males reporting any kind of sexual harassment, sexual assault, or sexual abuse. And I think it's because of how it's treated, and that our reporting system, our legal system isn't used to then receiving reports from men. Then secondly, besides the stigma, I think there's a lot of concepts of toxic masculinity that is taught to males. And so I think males embody what they think masculine identity is, and masculine identity doesn't say that I am sexually taken advantage of. I think girls are taught that from a young age, having that conversation, saying to a young girl, don't let anyone touch you there, or if somebody makes you feel uncomfortable, stranger danger, call for help. But I don't think boys get the same messaging about sexual activity. And then the last thing I was thinking about is sexual prowess. So I think men are socialized into showing off their sexual prowess. And in a way, almost like a peacock does to attract the mate, I think men are made to act attractive so that they can draw a partner to them. And so I think part of that is then to show off your sexual pursuits instead of hiding them. So I think that gets me sometimes also a little confused if it's against their will. And a young boy, even introduced to sex at a young age, will show off and brag to his friends at the age of, let's say, 10 or 11, that he's had sex, because it is something to brag about. So I think there's a lot of social conditioning around, men talking about their sexual exploits, even from as young as childhood. Hunt, you had a question there?
Seeing that I'm a male here on the panel, I just want to use an example that maybe links up, Nazine, with what you're saying. When I was a student, I was living in a house with two fellow students, and Zorba the Greek, the movie was showing at that stage. And there's a scene from Zorba the Greek, I can still remember this line, where he says there's only one sin that God won't forgive, and that's when a woman asks a man to a bed and he refuses her. And it's this thing of like that a man should always say yes, and if you don't say yes, it's exactly what you're saying. I mean, then I can still remember this line, because this is what the guys were saying in
So even if unwarranted, even if unsolicited, if men are offered sex, they're conditioned to accept it. So even in power exploitative relationships where there is, let's say, a senior at work that then tries to approach a young man for sex, the man is sort of conditioned not to say no. And what would that say about him? So I think that is a problematic message that we are sending to young people, that they can't. And I think this ties in nicely into consensual sex. So consensual sex is something that is highly important, but in all relationships, not just in a relationship where you are having a partner or you are just having a sexual relationship with someone. It is also important in marriage. And I think this should form part and parcel of couples therapy or, marital counseling before a couple gets married, is that you agree to having sex, whether that be verbally, and if you know each other well enough, it can be non-verbally once there has been a very thorough discussion that was had before the time. And I think you contact with that person, you contact what is okay, what isn't okay, what I do like, what I don't like. And if we are going to go somewhere that I don't feel comfortable with, that you are going to speak to me about it beforehand, and we agree on how far we can go. So it's always kind of And I think for me, always in couples therapy, I don't like the term compromise, because in compromising, one partner always doesn't get, the opinion doesn't get heard and valued. So I always think we negotiate. So negotiate is that we both come to the table, we both kind of lose a little bit, but we also win. So it's always about negotiation, and that is consensual. And I think once people get married, people assume that you have sort of sexual access to a partner at all times, and that's not true. Your body
Mm,
remains your body. You still need to ask consent, whether you do that verbally or, with couples, you can develop a non-verbal way of kind of hinting that you would like to have sex with your partner, and your partner can in a nice way then say, maybe not tonight, or they're not feeling in the mood, but you can figure out your own language as a couple, but it should
mm,
still be consensual.
mm.
Yes.
There's a nice analogy that I once saw on the internet about a cup of tea. That you must ask somebody for a cup of tea. If they say yes, then you can go make the tea. If you come back and that person says, no, I don't want tea anymore, you can't force this person to have tea. The same way, you can't give tea to somebody who's asleep. You can't give tea to somebody who doesn't want tea. You can't force tea on somebody. But Nazneen, also to tie in with that about, the sex just being implied that I'm married now, this is my sexual partner, this person should say yes whenever and wherever. But also just about pleasure, that now we are sexual partners and we are in love and we love each other, and that both of us should just have pleasure all the time. And it doesn't happen like that. There are
No.
limitations. There are things and there are conditions that could limit pleasure for both partners. And maybe you can talk to us a little bit about that as well.
So we had a question from one of our colleagues, Ruby, and
Mm,
she asked about the discrepancy between libidos in terms of having two or more partners in a relationship. And this can be in a marriage or a relationship. So I think what is important here is that we should, I think, realize that not everybody's libido is on the same level. So
mm,
if you are in a relationship with a partner and there are different levels of libido, that you then pace yourself slower, go according to the pace of the partner whose libido isn't as high, and then start introducing things slowly. And you can have a lot of sexual foreplay that doesn't actually lead to sexual activity. And I think people only think about sex as sexual penetration, but it also is
mm,
all the kinds of foreplay, or just kind of even just flirting can be a part of foreplay. And that can start hours, if not days, before you start to have sex. So if
mm,
somebody's libido isn't as high, there needs to be an effort made by both partners to try and meet that person halfway, and to slowly introduce a graded approach to kind of getting that person to have sexual pleasure with things other than penetrative sex, if that is what is
mm,
maybe causing the problem. Yeah.
mm. It's, you know what's so interesting with what you're saying, that the focus that most people focus on sex, the penetration or the act, and they do not focus on the pleasure and the fun that's actually associated with having sex, and that they sort of miss out on the main component of that intimacy that they have with their partner.
And I want to mention that the World Health Organization in 2017 has made sexual rights as part of human rights. And so
Oh,
that's how
interesting.
important our right is to experience sexual pleasure, and to access our own sexual pleasure. And so I think there should be a lot of experimentation to find out what works for you. For one person, it might just be holding hands with someone, and that might
Mm,
be pleasurable for them. It might be cuddling with someone or dressing up in a particular outfit. It can really
mm,
be anything. And we must also remind ourselves that sometimes sexual pleasure can start as almost anything. It can be, when somebody whispers in your ear or gets up really close to you and tells you you smell really good. So we must be more open-minded that it can be actually anything, and we must sort of kind of play around, get to know our partners, be playful, but I think also then be present. So we can't be thinking that, oh, we need to put the children to bed and then we need to kind of close our door and then we need to make sure that nobody hears. I think we must get into being playful in a responsible way, and trying sort of different strategies, being creative. And that doesn't cost money. You don't have to get sexy lingerie. You can just try with what you have and try to make something work out of
Mm.
it.
Hans?
Yeah, I think sexual intimacy doesn't, like you say, doesn't require you to take off your clothes. I think by having good conversations with your partner, that is can be also be very sexy. But I'm thinking, our colleague Ruby's question about, I think it's a real practical thing that we see in therapy is maybe one of the two partners were sexually abused. And it's very unlikely that this person will ever maybe move up the scale in terms of the frequency of sex, and there might be other reasons as well. So, like the question was, so if there's this discrepancy in libido, and one of the other partner decide to satisfy him or herself through masturbation or watching pornography to get off, what's your feeling on that? Do you think that's dangerous? Is it, what's your feeling?
So I think this for me, and I'm not coming from a moral stance or a religious stance, just from a health education stance. I think masturbation can actually be something that can be positive in a relationship and in a couple. So I think masturbation here is, so when you enter into a relationship or into a marriage, we don't take ownership over our partner's bodies. Our partner's bodies still belong to them. And if we believe in a creator, we believe that we've been created. So we go into a covenant with someone or in a relationship with someone, but that means that I still own my body. And for whatever I do with my body, I can share that experience with you and I can negotiate how I receive pleasure for myself. But that means that we have a discussion. So for me, this is also another conversation that you have, that you contract. How does each partner feel about masturbation? You can include masturbation in a relationship that can sexually be pleasurable for both partners. So both partners can participate, both partners can observe. So it doesn't have to be that you are in some ways maybe cheating on me, and or this is, I'm not getting what I need to get out of this relationship, so I know I need to do it for myself. You still need to address the underlying problem there, that is that we are not communicating about what our sexual needs are. And in essence, that's going to cause a bigger rift in the relationship later on if we don't address it now. So having a conversation. But I think also if somebody has been sexually abused, there's a lot of non-sexual touch that can happen. Just getting that person to feel safe, even just with a back rub, or even just with doing something sweet for that person. So coming home and maybe just telling that person that, thank you for the lovely meal that you're cooking, appreciating that person. So it can come in many forms. It doesn't need to be sexual. And I think if you can get past that, and it might take years together with therapy for that person to be able to enjoy a sexual relationship, but you can eventually get there. And if you understand your partner's triggers, you can be aware of staying away from the trigger points until that person has processed what the triggers are in therapy. And I think that can go a long way. And if your partner is in therapy, ask if you may be invited to a session to have a conversation in a controlled environment, in a safe environment, and speak about what your concerns are and what should you do as a supportive partner. Yeah.
Nesrine, what type of other conditions do you see in your practice as you working amongst consensual partners?
Mhm. So I think the sexual landscape is changing quite rapidly. And I think trying to keep up with the new terminology, of what patients are sort of calling themselves and the kind of relationships they are going into. I think that has been sort of what I've been experiencing, I think, since COVID. And I think there was a lot of online, participation in social media and then watching, series, movies during that time. So people were exposed to a lot of these things that have now become normalized. So people are now experimenting. So, for example, I've got patients that would come in and call themselves like demisexual or pansexual, and they exploring those kinds of relationship, and they want to kind of experiment, I think, by meeting partners that are like-minded. And then also we see a lot of people that are now starting to I think experiment online with online dating, and this has now happened for the last 10 years. I think that people are experimenting and sometimes just trying to figure out what is it that I want from this person that I'm chatting to. Is it just a sexual relationship or is it something more long term? So I think
Mhm.
we are seeing a lot of those kind of issues, which I think hasn't really been problematic before coming
Mm.
into therapy.
Nesreen, I'm also thinking in terms of medical conditions. If you can maybe
Mm,
just, we've got a few minutes before we go to a break. But also, I mean, our bodies change as we grow older and as we go through different
mm,
medical conditions. A
Mm.
person
mm,
who maybe has got diabetes or they went for chemo or
mm,
whatever, high blood pressure,
mm,
that can affect your sexual health and your
mm,
sexual life. And sometimes
mm,
people don't know that it's due to my medical illness.
mm,
So if you can
mm.
maybe, I don't know if you want to let us stay till after the break.
Yes, let me
Mm.
answer comprehensively rather,
Okay.
because it
So
it is quite a interesting topic, especially because we might have a lot of listeners that have chronic conditions that have side effects.
nou luisteraars, daar is die invitation nou vir julle om saam te luister en saam te gesels. Die nommer is 060 505 2693 en ons luister na Nasneen se liedjie van Dragonflies en Astronauts deur die Palatons. Geniet dit en kom weer terug.
Root.
Welkom terug luisteraars hier by ons sit koppe by mekaar. Vanaand gesels ek en Hans lekker met Nasneen vir daar uit die Kaap uit. Sy's 'n kliniese sielkundige en haar belangstelling is in seksuele gesondheid. Luisteraars, teen die tyd het julle nou al die nommer, maar vir die wat nou net ingeskakel het, ons praat oor seks vanaand en seksuele gesondheid en die nommer is 060 505 2693. Julle mag anoniem bly, ons sal glad nie julle name noem nie, maar gesels so 'n bietjie saam met ons. Nasneen, ek het voordat ons op die breek gegaan het, het ek nou spesifiek gevra van mediese kondisies en kroniese siektes en ouderdom, dis ook ons 'n kroniese siekte amper. En hoe dit dan die seksuele gesondheid beïnvloed en ek dink soms weet mense nie eens nie. Al wat hulle weet is ons seksuele interaksie is nie meer soos dit was nie of is nie, ek weet nie wat gaan aan met my nie. Mans of vrouens verdink sommer mekaar as dit nie meer is soos wat dit was nie. So kan jy so 'n bietjie gesels oor hoe ons mediese kondisies ons seksuele gesondheid kan beïnvloed?
So I'd like to start by just advocating for patient rights. So if you are diagnosed with any medical condition, and especially if it's a chronic condition which you're going to have to monitor for the rest of your life, or it is degenerative, meaning that it's going to get worse in time, it is your right to ask a doctor, what does this medical condition really mean? So yes, you've diagnosed me with diabetes or with a heart condition, but what does that mean? And then what are the side effects to that? How will this not only affect my body and my health, how is this going to affect my lifestyle? What can I do to improve my lifestyle? So even if your consultation with your doctor or with a nurse is maybe 15 to 20 minutes, make that 20 minutes count. Go in, even if you can't do it at the time, have a follow-up appointment with that doctor. And when you go in for a review, say, I have a list of questions that I'd like you to answer. Can you please assist me? You can even start, you can approach, sometimes there's healthcare workers that do this online and just answer questions. So I think it's always important to understand the side effects. But I think one of the side effects is that it can adversely affect sexual performance and sexual pleasure. And so you need to know that the medication alone can affect sexual performance and sexual experience. But besides the medication, it can also be the chronic conditions. So there might, for example, be impotence in men, or difficulties with having a flaccid penis and not being able to get hard, to be able to then sort of complete sexual activity. Or you might have, with women, you might have sexual pain or sexual dryness. But there are tools that you can use. So if you start noticing that, let's say, for example, with sexual dryness, it's kind of a simple remedy. You need to find out a lubrication that is maybe not invasive, and then which would work best, and get samples. There are a lot of companies, even some healthcare centers, that provide samples of lubrication, and you test what works best for you. And then you can try that. If that doesn't work, go back to a healthcare worker and have a conversation. And so it's important to be sort of at least transparent with these issues so that it doesn't cause harm to the body. So that we do preventative rather than curative health once something has gone wrong. Yes?
You know what, Nasreen, I once attended a lecture where they were talking about vaginal dryness, especially when, for whatever reason, and lubrication, buying and procuring lubrication. And I remember the lecture saying, please do not use Vaseline. Please do not use Vaseline because it's not pH balanced. It can actually cause an infection. It's not good for the vagina. Was she right in saying that?
I think that's some great advice for our listeners. I think people try and substitute lubrication by using sort of strange things. Even with contraceptive health, I've heard of people using plastic packets for condoms, and condoms are freely available in clinics. So there really shouldn't be excuse. And if your clinic doesn't stock condoms, you need to ask the manager in charge to get in condoms, because that by law is supposed to be freely given in a healthcare facility. So with the same with lubrication, you can speak to a doctor and find out what is the best lubrication to use, and for whatever condition you do have. And that won't sort of give you other side effects. So it should be non-invasive, it should be approved, and it was well tested. So not something that you just kind of taking from at home or from your medicine cupboard. That is quite a big no-no, unless it is approved by your healthcare worker. And I think the best, so research says the best lubricant is silicone based.
And I do find what I see in the practice is that people also don't know about arousal techniques, because just adequate arousal before the time can help and aid in vaginal dryness as well, apart from lubrication. So sometimes that is also just the starting point.
I also think that, like you mentioned last week, actually, that, initially when we were in high school and everyone was sort of praying with each other, there was a lot of things that people were trying and heavy petting people were doing before they could actually have sex. So I think, and then as you hit adulthood and you are engaging in sexual behavior, then you kind of discard all of those things that you were doing that was also giving you arousal. So I think in the same way, start experimenting, even if it is just that you do kissing for a very long period of time, or just touching or dry humping, whatever it is that works for you. It doesn't have to be sexual at all. It doesn't have to be penetrative. It can just be that somebody is just if somebody is just having some sexual pleasure that is maybe not penetration, but that can help. Besides, so a lot of foreplay, a lot of maybe even just flirting or talking about fantasies, like you mentioned also last week, that can also cause arousal. So, but we are talking about lubricant because lubricant also protects the vagina. So I think it's important to take both parts.
Yes. We had a caller, a WhatsApp coming in saying TMI. I don't know if that's a disorder or is it too much information.
I think definitely too much information.
But I do hope that the information is helping our listeners out there. Hans, you had a question.
Well, you know, talking about sexual health, and referring to medical conditions, there are in the population between us, you know, a percentage that just, in terms of your biology, the organs aren't working, sexual organs aren't working like it could or it was working, and I think it's important for us as well to, you know, that a healthy individual mental state, it doesn't have to have sex.
Mhm.
You know, you can have a healthy relationship. I mean, I know of many people that's you know, sex is not part of their relationship, but there's incredible intimacy. So you know, when we spoke about unrealistic sort of stereotypes about what men are like, I also think yeah, that sex is sometimes being made too important. If I could come in from that side.
Mm. I think you're quite right, and I think it's what I think most people think intimacy is reached with sexual intimacy, but I think it can be as easy as just sort of getting to know your partner as your partner changes over the years, or doing something that is adventurous with a partner, and that too can bring intimacy. Or teaching a partner to do something that makes you both feel vulnerable. That is a place where intimacy grows, trust grows. So I think yes, we can explore other options, and I think this is part of what a sexual health consultation is about: is finding out what has worked for the partners in the past, and what can we capitalize on and continue to make that work, and what can we maybe just start doing a little bit differently, so that we can increase the connection between the partners.
Nazneen, we have spoken now about sexual health, chronic diseases, and how it can affect your sexual health. And we've spoken about libido. We've spoken about vaginal dryness. We've spoken about erection. We've spoken about a little bit about sexual pain. Not really that much. Maybe if you can give a sentence or two on that. But I want to link it also. Maybe just first talk about sexual pain, and then I'll ask the second bit.
So I think sexual pain needs a comprehensive health assessment to be done before. And so sometimes sexual pain, we need to exclude that it's not just medical. And once we have that results, then we can look at what are the psychological obstacles or blockages, and is that why you're experiencing sexual pain? And then there can be a multi-tiered approach, which could be medical, it can be physiotherapy, and like I mentioned last week, it can strengthen core muscles, which would decrease pain levels and increase tolerance, and that then can become sexual pleasure again. And then I think we can do psychology. So I think it's like a holistic approach to sort of just sexual pain. So sexual pain can also start at different points. It can start after a woman has had a pregnancy and given birth. It can start way before that, if a female is a virgin and then starts experiencing sexual pain. So I think we need to understand first. So it's more contextual, I think, for me, and understanding the history there, the sexual history, before we come up with a treatment plan.
Okay, so one last question is almost up, but also some of these disorders can actually start after infidelity as well, right?
Yes. And I think in that sense, it's probably more psychological. So it is a maladaptive coping mechanism or a defense mechanism that is then introduced to protect the person that has been harmed. And then that person might develop the behavior of feeling sexual pain, or just feeling disinterested in sex completely, or just not feeling safe with a partner. So
and how do you bridge this? My last question, how do you bridge infidelity Because people think that when they say, please forgive me, and they've made up, and the one partner has broken up with their lover or whatever, they're back together, then everything must be hunky-dory, and it's not. How do you bridge this infidelity?
So I think it's very difficult work, couple therapy work to do, because there's a lot of variables that the therapist is controlling for in the room, and you have to respond to what is happening in the present, but you're also responding to all the underlying issues that plays up in a therapy room. So I think you need to keep track of what is the origin. So in a session, a couple might just complain about, not taking out the dirt. But then you'll spend a whole session talking about not taking out the dirt bin, but it's actually not about that. So you have to understand what the root cause is, because the patients involved don't have insight into what is happening. They play out the dynamic. So with infidelity, there needs to be a willingness on the partner that has forgiven to continue to forgive every day, in the same way that you choose that partner. It is a daily meditation that you have to do. You have to choose to forgive. And also, I always tell my couples that if one of you win, nobody's winning. We're all losing. Both of you need to win here. It's not a contest. We're not trying to choose who did wrong, who is right now, who is wrong now. We don't keep the score. So you need to not play that game where we are keeping score over the other person. We're not testing the other person to test that if they do this, then it means they are now trustworthy. It is taking the risk. It's taking the risk to say that I need to reestablish the trust. Both of us need to do that. So yes, that person needs to assist me in doing that, but also that I need to be open and take the risk to take the leap again with this person. And trust this person.
Nazneen, I think we can speak a whole year. I think we can run a conference, but our time is up. Just one last sentence that you want to tell the audience before we go.
I think I want to say that I hope this is helpful as a conversation starter. Even if this gets your brain juices flowing, I hope that you speak to a friend or to a colleague or to a healthcare worker, but have the conversation.
Hans, one sentence, one word.
I'll remember, Nazneen, what you said now about it's a daily choice, that you take, and that there's no, if there's a winner, everyone is losers. I think in terms of sexual health, that's an important message.
And I just want to thank you, Nazneen, for coming. It has been interesting. And I think the one thing that I want to remember is that sexual pleasure is important, and sexual pleasure starts in the brain. And so don't focus on the main event, don't focus on the end goal, focus on the main event as well. And so we have to greet you. Mense, ek hoop het was interessant. Kom weer volgende week terug wanneer ons weer kop op in mekaar sit. Luister na 'n liedjie van Black Coffee. There's music in the air. Lekker aand vir julle.
Far from